So we're taking a little break from our Heidelberg Catechism tonight. You know, October 31st, what do we celebrate? The Reformation. It's another anniversary of the Reformation. It's October 31st, Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk in the Wittenberg church in Germany, he nailed 95 theses to that church door. And that seemingly, usual event, because it was a thing among scholars and professors in the university that when they wanted to have a disputation and they wanted to call the department and those that were learned to discuss a particular subject, they would then post certain theses for them to be discussed among, the department, those that had to do with certain matters of philosophy, religion, law, etc. So Luther, on October 31st, 1517, nailed those theses to that door. And it was in response, to, and this is how history is all connected, right, in many different events. It was a response to an effort by the Pope of the time, I think it was Clement VII, if I'm not mistaken, who wanted to rebuild the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. Now, this basilica, there was a church there, and that the church there in Rome, the old St. Peter's church, dated back to the time of Constantine. We're talking about 4th century. So 300 and somethings when that church of St. Peter had been built. So fast forward 1,200 years, this edifice was in disrepairs and shambles. And the Pope wanted to rebuild it and wanted it to be a statement of the, you had, I thought you had your arm up. Okay. He wanted it to be a statement of the glory of the Roman Catholic Church and what he represented and all that, but he didn't have the money for it. He was short on funds. He was a pope that loved to spend lavishly, as a few popes did, and didn't have a lot of coin to be able to do that. And it just so happens that there was another prelate, another religious officer in the Roman Catholic Church of the time, the Archbishop of Magdeburg in one of the territories of Germany, that also wanted to raise funds because he had bought several religious positions and he had to pay for them. It was also a practice of the time that was called simony, that if you were a bishop or if you were somebody with ecclesiastical ambitions, if you had the money, you could buy a religious office. You could buy, to be a bishop, an archbishop, and this would represent monies that would flow into you. And if you had lots of money, you could buy several positions, even in different localities. And then what would happen is that somebody like the Archbishop of Mainz, he had several of these bishoprics. And then they would leave people there in their place, rather than the bishop tending to these parishes and churches and places. They would just be absentee officers, and they would just collect the monies that would come in and they were due, and it was a form of enrichment. So this man had also come by some offices, but he had to pay for them. So he agrees with the Pope that they're going to launch a series of indulgences in his territories in order to pay for, in part, the building of the Basilica of St. Peter. That was the Pope's ambition. and then also to pay for the Archbishop of Mainz debts to the Fuggers, the German bankers at the time that had lent him the money to do some of these purchases. So then we come to know the character Tetzer. Remember Tetzer, the monk, the Dominican friar, I think, that starts going through the territories with a great entourage, selling these indulgences. And the indulgences is what calls Luther's attention as some of his parishioners were coming across the border from his territory in Saxony and Mainz, and he was appalled at the abuses that these indulgences were proclaiming. Not that the indulgences had not been carried out before, but Tetzer had really taken it to an extreme. And you could buy an indulgence, supposedly, that could spring somebody off of purgatory immediately. Your dead relative could spring him off from purgatory, and he would have this elaborate. If you could think of media of today, Tetzer would be this conglomerate of an entourage that would have, all of these sound effects and people screaming and the flames of purgatory, and then scaring, the peasants and the populace into thinking that you need to do this because your family right now is crying out for you and suffering. Okay? So one of the sayings was, when a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. So talk about this sloganeering that we are today we have really perfected this, right? I mean, this is the age of the slogans, of the little tidbit piece of Snapchat, or what's it called? Facebook, or the other one, the one the president uses as well. Twitter, and it's all about that little. Well, see, it's always being used throughout time to try and really whip up people emotionally. Because there's no way that you can really arrive at a certain position in life about significant issues with a little tiny bit of a statement, right? Things in life that are of substance require what? Reflection, right? Meditation, thinking, right? Reasoning. So, but these kinds of things do work in whipping up frenzy and emotion. And once your emotions are engaged, anything can happen.
No, I just wanted you to explain indulgences.
Yes, let's. That's a good. That's a good question. The Roman Catholic system way of salvation, okay, was a process throughout life, okay? It was a process throughout life that began at birth. And at birth, when you were baptized as a baby, that sacrament was supposed to infuse into you. By infusion, it's sort of like being pumped into your soul a quality of righteousness, an ability to now start striving after righteousness and holiness. So as a baby, being introduced to the church, being baptized, you were now in a state of grace. That state of grace allowed you to do what was in you. Matter of fact, that was one of the sayings of that period of the Middle Ages, especially, the late and high Middle Ages. And it was a saying that went like this, facere quod NC est in the Latin. And it meant, do what is within you. Do what is within you. Why? Why? Because God will not deny grace, salvation, to the person that does what is within them. In today's terms or translation, it could go something like this. Do your best, and God will do the rest. So that in a nutshell was Roman Catholic understanding of the time. So through a long life, obviously you would sin, right? And you would have need of the other sacraments of the church. Sacraments are ways to receive grace. Sacraments are there by the church to help you receive, restore, or help this virtue that is in you, with which you cooperate and work with, so that at the end, God will accept you. You're supposed to grow this virtue, this quality, this infusion of grace that is in you now from baptism. You're supposed to work with it, cooperate with it, strive after it, make use of all the sacramental system of the church, so that at the end, you would be accepted by God, okay? But, the Roman Catholic Church, in a pastoral manner, this was a pastoral issue for them and for the people. For the people that sinned, they had a way of helping them. And it involved, coming to a priest, okay, confessing your sin, confession, auricular confession to a priest, and then upon confession, which was preceded by a certain level of contrition, okay, or attrition. In other words, you had to have some sort of sorrow for your sin, some sort of being pained by your sin, and then you come into confession. And at confession, then the priest pronounces the absolution of sins, and in other words, forgiveness for the guilt of sin, and then prescribes penance. Prescribes penance. And while the absolution delivers forgiveness for guilt, there is still the necessity to work off the temporal punishments that accrue to you as a result of your transgression. Okay? In other words, at the end of the day, to make it into heaven, your soul must be pure. Your soul must be pure, clean. Okay? So, through the sacramental system of the church, you would be then in this grace, striving for it, using the sacramental system of the church, in this case now, confession and penance. And through confession, you are forgiven, and then you are once again restored to a striving after that sanctification, that purity of soul, that holiness, that cleanliness within you, so that God will eventually accept you. But that process of penance in your natural life is not enough for complete purgation of sins from your soul. Hence, voila, purgatory. Purgatory. So purgatory, believe it or not, is a pastoral recourse. When I say pastoral, I mean to help. Okay, if we give it if we put the best construction on it, on the side of the Roman Catholic Church, is the Roman Catholic Church telling the people, listen, okay, you've done your best, you've striven after holiness and righteousness your whole life. Okay, now you just go to purgatory. And that's the last stage. In other words, what awaits you after purgatory is entrance into heaven. So be of good cheer, be of good courage. It's there, it awaits you. It just takes this process. Now, how long? Nobody knew. How long? I mean, this was the unknown. Okay? That's why then during natural life, no one was certain of their salvation, nor could they be. That was considered presumptuous in this natural life to say, I am saved. What? You're saved. Now, you could say, I'm in a state of grace. The state of grace is the state in which you are striving for salvation. You are working for your salvation. You're cooperating with the infused virtue of the grace of God in you so that you can continue to cleanse, to purify, to purge, which eventually, the more you purify now here through penance, the less time in purgatory. The less time in purgatory. Maybe there's some super saints that because of their merit is so much that they either have very little time in purgatory or no time at all. But that was for very special grace granted to certain super saints that have lived extraordinary lives in ridding themselves of sin and purifying themselves from sin. So the indulgence then was supposed to shave off time in purgatory. But Tetzel being a good salesperson, said, the heck with some time. I'm going to say this is it. Just go for, what do you call it? Go for gold. You know, it's all. The moment a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Think about it. 16th century, uneducated, illiterate peasants, steeped in the obscurantism of the Middle Ages, filled with fear, yet with great hope for their loved ones. What would you have done? I would pay. I'd pay. You know, these, after all, are the people that are supposed to know for us. We don't know nothing. If they say it, and if it bears the stamp of the Pope, it's got to be true. So imagine when they're running across from Saxony to Mainz to this other territory where this is happening, and when they are carrying their way back into Luther's church, Luther is questioning this and saying, what is this? You know, and casting doubt upon this. And Luther thinks the Pope doesn't know about it. That this is some type of local, you know, abuse has taken place. So he takes it upon himself. Says, I'm going to start a debate on this. Okay? And he wants to do it in his local church. So he nails 95 theses. Okay? Which are basically about indulgence. About indulgences for the most part, okay? So at that time, 1517, it's not like Luther has a full, mature view of justification and biblical understanding. But he's on his way there, okay? So something else clicks in now. If this would have happened in the 13th century or beginning of the 15th century, nothing would have happened. What makes a difference? Question, trivia question. What makes a difference? Huh? Yes. 100 points. Gutenberg, in the middle of the 15th century, had invented the printing press, the movable printing press. Because the Chinese already had some type of press with wood blocks and things like that. But mid-15th century, the movable printing press is invented, and all of a sudden you could take, you know, you would have a set like that with metal little letters, and you can rearrange those letters and create sentences, and, you know, and then boom, start just printing out material and cranking it out. Folks, before the printing press was invented, things had to be copied, you know, or very tediously, you know, a particular manuscript could be with that Chinese method, but it was not really very effective and efficient, okay? Just to give you an example, a particular book that began to be printed from zero, from scratch, in the 1450s, by the 1500s, there were already 10 million copies of that particular book in 50 years. So the explosion of communication was unimaginable. I think it is akin to what's happened in the turn of our century, or the last of the 20th century, with technology, with the advent of computers, and the internet and all of that. All of a sudden, you had books galore being printed. And being printed now also in the vernacular, in the language of the people. In other words, once books began to be circulating, what do you think the people wanted? More books, more knowledge. They wanted to read because they didn't know how to read. So the humanists, that's another background to the story, there was a rebirth, of interest in the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome, in the learning, in the literature, in rhetoric, in poetry, in oratory, in learning. So this now began to infect and caught up in Europe like wildfire. Going back to the sources, going back and reading material, breaking out of just the Latin to the vernacular. And then you have languages are being formed. Languages are being created. Because you have probably very rudimentary ways of communicating among those peasants in Germany, or those peasants in England or Italy. But once humanism and the Renaissance and the printing press start cranking out, and the humanists are starting to, bringing up this rebirth of learning and letters, and people want to read, then they start getting documents and books in their own language. And then you get the English of Chaucer in Britain, England. And then you get the German of Luther. Luther does not just bring about religious reformation, if you will. He gave the German people the German vernacular. Dante in Italy. So languages are being formed. And what happens when a people is united by language? National identities are being created. See? So notice all the significance of that time of the Reformation. Okay? So going back to our little microcosm in the story, all of a sudden, when somebody takes those theses, and what do? Just crank them out and start circulating. And then it ran through wildfire through Europe. And the Pope got a hold of it. And the Archbishop of Mainz, the two compadres that were in this together, said, hey, we got to stop this monk because it's really hurting our business. So they start exerting pressure on Luther in the next few months and year. And then it begins to dawn on Luther that the Pope is in on this. I can't believe it. The Pope is in on this. This is not just this is coming from the hierarchy. And the more they try to squeeze the screws on Luther, the more reticent he gets. And the more then he begins to clarify his positions. Because I really now need to dig in and get ready for my defense. And a crucial moment comes in 1518 in a confrontation with one of the theologians that was an apologist for the Roman Catholic Church, and that was Eck of Ingolstadt, the renowned apologist for the Roman Catholic Church, for the Pope particularly in Leipzig. And this man probably should be credited for bringing out Luther, for him to finally shake off any perhaps efforts at trying to conciliate with Rome. Because there have been some precursors to the Reformation. One of them was John Huss. And John Huss had been burned at the Council of Constance for questioning the authority of the Pope. for coming out against the authority of the magisterium and for exalting the principle of sola scriptura. He was burned at the stake in 1410, I think, the Council of Constance. Let me tell you something very interesting. When he was being burned, he prophetically said something that's really astonishing. And he said something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing, behind me is coming one that is going to be like a swan that nobody will be able to stop. So something along those lines, okay?
Let me say it.
You have the quote?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Hus means ugly duck. And he says, today you cook a duck, but a beautiful swan is coming in 100 years. He's going to do away with all of it.
That's right. Wow. That's amazing, isn't it? That's amazing. That's incredible. It reminds me also of Latimer and Ridley, a century after that, during the massacre under Blood of the Mary, when they were burning in the square. And the two friends are dying. And one of them tells the other, cheer up, because we're stoking a fire that is going to spread all across Europe. So, so these are the makings of Reformation. And then Luther, Eck of Ingolstadt, then at some point he knows he's coming for the jugular. He wants to blow Luther out of the water finally and expose him where it matters and where it hurts so that they can kill him. In other words, are you under the authority of the Pope, yes or no? And then he begins to say, what you're doing, Luther, is the same thing that John Huss was doing. You are a Hussite. And Luther gets a break, and he didn't really know much about John Huss, and he studies crams up on Huss, comes back to the debate, and when pressed again, you know what he said? Yes, that's right. I am a Hussite. And the next year comes the Exsurgio Domine, the bull, in which Luther then is threatened by the church to finally just recant or be excommunicated, which Luther burns the bull on the streets of his town. And then in 1520 comes the excommunication decree by the Pope. Once that happens, it was the practice of the time that if the Roman Catholic Church excommunicates you, now you're handed over to the civic arm, to the king, to the emperor, and he tries you for heresy and has the power then to deliver punishment, which happens in the Diet of Worms in 1521. And Luther is condemned. And that's when he famously stands up and says, I cannot recant. To go against conscience is neither safe nor sound. Unless somebody can teach me otherwise on the basis of the Scripture, I can do no other. Here I stand, so help me God. And he's told, okay, bye-bye. They have promised him safe passage and say, okay, go. But knowing what had happened to John Huss a century before, then Frederick the Wise, who was the prince where Luther's university was, and a prince that was very proud of his university and of his people and of the German people, which was always in certain, struggle with the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, okay? Which they say was neither holy nor Roman, okay? But, so he says, I'm not going to let my monk be put to death. And he sends some knights under cover and under disguise, and they whisk Luther away. Nobody knows where. Frederick the Wise, the prince himself of that territory, it tells the knights, I don't want to know where you take him, just go ahead and hide him somewhere. So the emperor keeps asking the prince, hey, where's Luther? What happened? So, I don't know. I don't know what happened to him, you know. And so he spends there, you know, a year or so in, you know, tucked away in some little, the Warburg castle or, you know, compound, and he writes. He starts writing out some documents that are very important for the Reformation and translates into German the New Testament and eventually the whole Bible. Okay? So that also then started catching on in Germany in such a way that many and some of the princes begin to back up the Reformation. And they come together and they protest. And that's where the term Protestant comes from. See, Germany at the time was made up of different territories. And each territory had a prince, okay? And these princes were independent. And then you had the Holy Roman Emperor that ruled over those territories and Spain. And the new land found in the New World. That was Charles, the Emperor. So he was a ruler in the Netherlands. He dominated vast territories, okay? Italy, to a certain extent, he was also in conflict with. So these princes rise up and protest. Or, you know, toward the end of the 1500s, 1527, 1528, the Diet of Speyer. Now the question is, how come the emperor did not put them down? Oh, God's providence. Another bit of history here, God's providence. Why? Because the Turks were threatening the empire from the east. And war with France was threatening the emperor from the west. And the Pope in Rome did not want a very powerful emperor so that he could have certain autonomy in his territories in Italy. So the emperor has to bite the bullet, you know, and give them some free rein. And that is the end of the movie. How many of you have seen the movie Luther? So what he's expecting at any moment, oh, catch it, the new one is, you have the old one, which is a classic, great, but the new one is fantastic. So it's incredible. We have played it here on this night many times, so that's why we decided not to do it, because maybe it should just be a ritual, a tradition. I'm always playing the movie on this night. Maybe we'll see it shortly, okay? So Luther is expecting that the forces of the emperor are going to fall upon him. And then he hears a good news. That's what good news is, the gospel. Or the gospel of the victory of the Protestant forces. That, you know, they have, their protest has been registered and it's been accepted. And, you know, they're getting a new lease on life, so to speak. So those are the historical events of that decade. Okay? Eventually, you know, these territories and the Reformation spreads, okay? There's also another Reformation happening in Switzerland. So you have Germany to the north, right, in Europe. And then you have Switzerland, right to the north of Italy, right? So then you have the Netherlands, the Dutch to the top. So all of this territory begins to be convulsed in Reformation. Okay? You have another character by the name of Ulrich Zwingli, who is the one that also launches Reformation in Switzerland. Okay? And then you begin to have these two strands of Reformation thought in the Reformed. Let's just put a little word of clarification here. We can speak of Reformation in a very broad umbrella. To say everything that springs up from the protest, right? That is evangelical, Protestant, right? Could be said, or could be called Reformed, okay? So that's in a generic sense. And many different denominations spring up. You have, and then among that Reformed umbrella, you have the Reformed denomination coming from Switzerland, and the likes of Zwingli, who dies soon in a battle against Roman Catholic forces. And then you have Bullinger, who takes over for him. You have Butzer in Strasbourg. You have John Calvi in Geneva, and others that follow, okay? But eventually, as this Reform wave continues to advance, it is no longer just Reformed and Lutherans, which were the two main branches of the Reformation. Eventually, then you have others that just go in other different ways, such as the Anabaptists, for example, a more radical wing of the Reformation that wants to separate from the state, that makes more emphasis in a very personal piety, you know, and in small groups, and really being holy, and a membership of the church that is really the true ones, etc. So those will be the Anabaptists. Eventually then the Baptists spring up as well. Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Methodists, those were all offshoots of the Reformation and the two main branches of Reformed and Lutheran. So all of these other offshoots begin to spring up. Anglicanism in England, right? So these are all drinking from the big Reformed tradition, and especially the two branches, Lutheranism and the Reformed denomination. With Lutheranism, or Luther, being the main trunk, so to speak, that everybody looked back to with great admiration and respect, okay? There were also internal strife and differences, etc. And Luther was very obstinate and never ever gave an inch in his dealings with differences with other folks. So that's the story of the Reformed tradition historically. Any questions on that historical context? Any questions on that?
Muslims had gone all the way to Vienna. And all of a sudden they left. Consider it a miracle. They feared something and thought God was going to provide. And they take off. And the next morning they said, where are you? We're supposed to be defeated today.
I think that's part of a soap opera that's been circulating.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I think. Sometimes you have, in Spanish, there's this Brazilian, what do you call them, novelas? Turkish. It's Turkish? Okay. La Sultana. Yeah. Right. No? Okay. Anyways, any questions on that historical piece, guys? Yes.
The question is, where did it came from? Since the Christian came, the religion came from the apostles.
Sure. That's a very good question. That's a very,
It came from
yeah.
these people are burning, in the name of.
Sure. Well, what happens throughout history is that there is a gradual declension from the truth. And we already have that prophesied by Paul. What did Paul say? After I am gone, there will come after me ravenous wolves that will not forgive the flock, that will decimate the flock. I think we can see there that prophetic voice about what was to happen in the next few centuries in the history of the Christian church. So what happened was, in part, that the Christian church, once the apostles are gone and some of those initial followers of the apostles, there are many doctrines and doctrinal winds that begin to circulate throughout the church. Remember, at the very beginning also, you don't have the Bible yet compiled. You have certain portions of scriptures that are circulating. You know, you have certain letters, so we need to understand that. This makes it difficult in a way. People don't know how to read or write. We don't have, you know, the luxuries that we have today of coming up with information. Okay? Also, you have the pressures of the Roman Empire. So the pressures of the Roman Empire in the next couple of centuries after the first century that ends up with the death of the last apostle John toward the end of the century, the Romans looked upon Christians with great suspicion because they hated anything that was new. If there was any religion that could claim pedigree going back centuries, they were respected. But this new sect called, you know, the Way, eventually Christians, that do not pay homage to the emperor, to the empire's gods, that do not participate in the entertainment and it seems the religious civic life, if you will, of the Roman Empire, the Colosseum, you know, the Greco-Roman philosophy, then you're looked at with great suspicion and derision. So persecutions are unleashed. They begin to be slaughtered by the Roman Empire in different waves. It wasn't always steady and constant, and it was throughout different territories in different times. But that persecution and this degree of isolation and being outside of the culture of the time causes many Christians to try and find common ground. Common ground with the philosophical winds of the age. So you have many apologists trying to find common ground with Greek philosophy, for example, or with Stoicism of the Romans. And then what happens is that Christianity becomes another philosophy of moralism as it drifts further and further away from the gospel that Paul preached. What becomes entrenched is Christianity as a philosophy, a religion of virtue and moralism, or there's always this other brand. You know that charismatics have always been with us? Yeah, the mystics. The mystics. In other words, those that are just looking for the ecstatic escapade and flight, and not necessarily scripture and knowledge and understanding and doctrine, you know, but just this kind of the soul merging, you know, with the one, you know, being lifted up and becoming one with God, and you know, that kind of stuff. So all kinds of weird things begin to percolate. Okay?
Thompson, it is a Catholic. That is Catholic. Actually, San Juan de la Cruz, for example, in Spain.
Yep.
If you read his poem, you think you are in these churches.
That's exactly right.
That is the original.
There's nothing new under the sun, okay? It is just a recycling of the same in contradistinction from the true gospel. There is a gospel, and then there's everything else, okay? So, by the time the 4th century comes around, we then get Constantine, that now reverses the fortunes of Christianity and now entrenches Christianity as an official religion. So that's in the 4th century. And that also brought its own liabilities and problems, because Christianity was never intended to be wed to power. And every time people want to wed Christianity with power, then Christianity loses out. So then you begin to get the ascendancy of the papacy, the Pope, the Rome, as that particular seed that would make decisions for the others, and then eventually begin to get different doctrines in order to justify that throughout the Middle Ages. One of those was the donation of Constantine, which was a forgery. In other words, at some point the popes, later on, Middle Ages, said, it was Constantine, the Christian king, that when he died, he donated his rule as earthly rule, material, physical, political rule, he donated it to the church. In other words, he from God gave the Pope the right to rule, not just in matters spiritual, but also in matters politically. So all of this is congealing and coming together to the time of the Reformation. Through it all, there's always groups and certain thinkers. Obviously, since we don't have a lot of writing prior to, there are some, we get some glimmers of some folks along the way, which seem to have more affinity to the gospel. The Lollards in England. There was another group in Italy. Forgetting the name now. And then just different other persons. John Wycliffe in England. Yeah, definitely. That was probably, but even before Gottschalk was another one. Bradwardine. So there were certain precursors. The Lollards, oh my God, this group was persecuted in Italy. This other group. So then we get to, that's how things got all messed up. So God had this movement in the 16th century, begun by Luther, that gave us that rebirth of what Paul taught. And that gave us the Bible in our common language. And that gave us different church structures and organizations and autonomy and independence that we have today. Otherwise, we'd all be Roman Catholics. Pretty much.
It was a slow deterioration.
Yeah, sure.
In the 9th century, the Pope overrode the king, the emperor. So the powers had switched.
Based on that donation.
Right, and then
Yeah.
years later, after Thomas Aquinas, then
Yeah.
it really starts to go back. It really goes back for 300 years to Luther.
Yeah. Folks, if you can read, if you're here, I take it you can read English. So I can give you, if you're interested, this was my doctoral dissertation, and I cover this in the book. And then I have a very strong tracking of Luther in his doctrinal journey and struggles. So it has a historical doctrinal part in the first half. And then the last part is an application of that to pastoral counseling with some counseling vignettes. So, if any of you wants it, I got a few copies here. If you have not gotten one, I'd be more than happy to give it to you. Any questions to wrap it up? Oh, the book is called By Gospel Alone. A historical, doctrinal, and pastoral counseling perspective on the primacy of the gospel. And then you will have a bibliography in the back that I strongly recommend you review and then launch to further more specific reading from there as well. Any questions?
Also available on Amazon.
Also available on Amazon. But you can get it here free.
I know.
And then make a donation. Not the donation of Constantine. Or to St. Peter's Basilica, for that matter. Okay, well, let's stop there and let's pray. What we could do next week is we could talk a little bit more of the theological. In other words, today we covered the history and some theological stuff, but we can get more into the doctrinal stuff next week. And we'll give you a sample of a couple of the chapters on Luther and things like that, okay?